All U.S. troops have officially left Afghanistan. They have now ended America's longest war. This grainy night vision image just sort of shows you exactly what we're talking about and encapsulates what has happened there in Afghanistan. It shows Major General Chris Donahue of the 82nd Airborne Division boarding the last U.S. military cargo plane to leave Kabul's airport yesterday. He was the very last American service member to leave that country, marking an end to the decades-long conflict. The Taliban now have full control of Kabul's airport, while the State Department leads ongoing efforts to evacuate Afghan allies and any remaining Americans who wish to leave the country. Charlie D'Agata is in Qatar with more.
Defensive flares lit up the sky as some of the last American C-17s flew out of Kabul for good. Moments later, the nighttime fireworks display came from tracer fire as celebratory Taliban gunfire rang out across the capital. The last American soldier to leave, Major General Christopher Donahue. By morning light, the Taliban made clear the country was under new management, strolling through the airport, posing with some of the disabled military equipment left behind. The flights have stopped, stranding an unknown number of Afghans who wanted to flee Taliban rule. Some of those lucky enough to escape wound up here at the Al Udeid Air Base in Doha. In 2 weeks, hangars were transformed into holding areas for 55,000 Afghan refugees.
If you make every country journey, we will go here.
It doesn't matter what country you go to.
Yes.
You just need to go.
Yes.
America's longest war came to an end with a chaotic, calamitous mass evacuation and a suicide bombing from ISIS-K that cost the lives of 13 U.S. service members and 170 Afghan citizens. Remaining Americans and Afghans holding special visas will either have to pack buses for the border, wait for the airport to reopen, or hunker down. They have little more left now than hope the Taliban make good on their promise they won't be prevented from leaving, and hope that America still holds any influence over an enemy it was unable to defeat.
A new chapter of America's engagement with Afghanistan has begun. The military mission is over. A new diplomatic mission has begun.
Physically, the diplomatic mission now moves here. The U.S. Embassy will now be operating out of Doha, Qatar. It's not only a major regional U.S. ally, but the country has served as a go-between with the Taliban. That role is only going to become more important in the future. Anne-Marie and Vlad?
All right, Charlie, thank you. So for more, let us bring in CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. Weijia, President Biden is facing questions about leaving some Americans behind after previously saying that troops would stay past the August 31st deadline if necessary. He had asked for contingency plans. That's what we were told. How many Americans still remain in Afghanistan, and how is the president responding to these questions? And I understand just because someone is an American doesn't necessarily mean that they want to leave Afghanistan, but presumably there are still people left there that do want to leave.
Right, Anne-Marie, and that's a really important distinction because there are a group of Americans who are choosing to stay behind for various reasons. They might have dual citizenship, they might have a life there that they don't want to leave, family members, but there's also a group of Americans who would like to be evacuated. And the question is now what the president plans to do to make sure they get out. And we heard from Secretary Antony Blinken yesterday, who said that he believes that number is about 200 and likely closer to 100 U.S. citizens. And he vowed that they would continue to work to get those people out. You're seeing a graphic right now of a previous statement from President Biden, who said that, you know, if there were Americans who remained there past the deadline of August 31st, he said troops would stay. So perhaps it's not that black and white as he will later try to explain, but to someone listening who was in the room, it certainly sounded like he was making that commitment. And as Vlad pointed out, saying that there would be contingency plans if there were Americans that remained there. But this administration has really tried to stress the massive nature of this airlift and focus on how many people they were able to get out. And it is a remarkable number, 120,000 people over the past couple of weeks, including about 6,000 Americans. And so as for those left behind, officials say they are in direct contact with those people and trying to navigate them, help them get to the airport safely. And they believe that the Taliban will keep up their commitments to allow safe passage. The trouble there is that the president has also said repeatedly that he does not trust the Taliban, but they also think it is in their best interest to allow those Americans to safely leave.
Weijia, let me ask you about House Republicans who are looking to pass some legislation to hold the Biden administration accountable for what they call a disastrous withdrawal, and also to demand for a plan to bring those Americans who were not able to leave before the timeline home. What can you tell us about that? And is the White House itself, is the administration itself looking for possibly an investigation into what went wrong?
Well, they have said as much, right? I mean, top officials from the Pentagon and the State Department have said there will be a time to reflect and look back and to examine every single detail of this withdrawal and the execution of it to do better next time. But House Republicans, you're right, Vlad, are very sharply criticizing the president now for the way in which the U.S. exited Afghanistan, and they want answers. But it's not just Republicans; it's some Democrats too, who are, spearheading investigations through committees to try to better understand the decision-making process and what the administration knew and when they knew it, when they made the decision to leave in this way. And so that, I think, is just beginning. And we should expect a very long process of lawmakers calling people into testimony and asking for specifics about what happened. But to your other point, Republicans are demanding more clarity about the plan to bring those 100 to 200 Americans back home, which we hopefully will hear from President Biden later this afternoon. I don't know how much more he can say beyond what we've already heard from his national security advisor, his Secretary of State, about the diplomatic effort already underway.
Well, it's funny because that's what I was going to ask you about his remarks and whether or not we have any indication what he's going to say. He's going to be speaking, of course, about the end of war in Afghanistan, but can we expect to hear anything more from him?
Well, he did release a statement yesterday. It was a kind of a preview of what he would say, because he did say he would directly address the American people about his decision not to stay beyond the August 31st deadline. I think he's well aware of the comments that he already made that are on the record, which was a commitment to do exactly that when asked during a very public interview about what happens if there are still people there who want to come home. And so he'll have to explain that and also talk about next steps forward for the country and what sort of leverage that the administration has over the Taliban. But he also said in this statement that they are working not only as an administration, but with international partners to ensure the safe passage of not only Americans, but other foreign nationals and Afghan allies who want to leave. But guys, I think the big question is why you would assume the Taliban would honor those commitments now that the U.S. has left, when they were not even doing that when we were still there. Americans is one issue, but then you have thousands of Afghan allies who we saw desperately trying to get to the airport and were unable to clear those checkpoints. So why now would they give in, especially now that there is no U.S. presence there?
Those are really important
and
questions.
I think also the other, Weijia and Vlad, the other thing is, after the ISIS-K attack at the airport, the other question is what are the capabilities in terms of ensuring security? Because it's not just the Taliban. There are other entities. ISIS-K is just one of them.
Right. I mean, just yesterday we heard from top Pentagon officials who were not, who were very clear-eyed about the threat that ISIS-K posed, especially after what we saw in that devastating attack at the airport that took the lives of 13 U.S. service members. And so the threat is real. And that is something that the administration is saying very loudly and not trying to minimize, because we have all seen what they are capable of. We also know, though, that they were able to play defense and stop more rockets from being launched towards the airport. But, you know, the threat continues to brew because of those affiliates who are now free in Afghanistan. And by the way, we should note that it is the Taliban who released a lot of those ISIS affiliates when they released prisoners from prisons throughout the country during their takeover. We're talking about thousands of prisoners that included ISIS affiliates.
Very important questions all, Weijia and Anne-Marie, and one that I also have, Weijia, which is what is the president prepared to do if we have intelligence, credible intelligence, that some of these organizations that we're talking about, ISIS-K, the Haqqani Network, and Al-Qaeda, start to become resurgent? Some might say that they're already resurgent, but what will the United States commitment be to the 20 years where we've tried to build that country into a viable democracy? Are we just going to turn our backs? We are at the eve of the anniversary of September 11th. We know what turning our backs on a country can bring in the future. So these are important questions, and I know you in the White House press corps will do your best to get some answers when the president does appear to address the American people. Is he going to take questions, Weijia, or is it just the president making a statement?
We never know, Vlad, until the moment. It is sort of his call, right? And his aides are very quick to tell us that they themselves don't necessarily know. Sometimes it is planned, sometimes it is a formal press conference, and they will tell us that the president is expected to take questions. That's not the case today. As of right now, it seems that he's just going to make remarks. But I've watched him before, and if someone asks, many times he wants to answer questions, and he will engage with reporters, especially when there are so many questions, as you mentioned, that not only we have, but I think American people have about the future of that country.
Yeah, so true, Weijia. Thank you so much.
Sure.